Keep your distance, you reek of the stables. But I only wanted to poke. Don't touch me. You'll ruin my dress.
What would you do if the one person everyone in the room chose to look past turned out to be the only one standing between you and the truth? Would you notice him at all, or would you look past him too, the way everyone else in that gilded room chose to do? The ballroom at Ashwick Hall glowed gold that night, chandeliers throwing warm light over silk gowns and polished boots, over laughter that sounded rich and easy and never quite reached anyone's eyes. Every lady standing had come to be seen, and every one of them found a way to sneer at the same person. A stable hand, dust still caught in the seams of his coat, crossed the edge of the dance floor carrying a tray no one had asked him to carry. Fans lifted to hide smirks. A young debutante stepped aside as though his shadow might soil the hem of her dress. He said nothing. He never did. Duke Julian Ashworth watched from the top of the staircase, arms folded, and told himself the boy's presence was beneath his notice, the way it was beneath everyone else's. But Julian noticed everything. That was the trouble with him, and what he noticed was that the stable hand's eyes never once settled on the dancing. They settled on the doors, on the shadows near the kitchen passage, on a girl in a gray dress who scrubbed candle wax from the floor and never lifted her head. Julian had spent his whole life reading rooms the way other men read ledgers, and something in this room did not add up. A servant who moved like a soldier, a maid who flinched at footsteps but never at fire. By the time the first waltz ended, the Duke of Ashwick had stopped watching the party entirely, and started watching the two people in it that no one else thought worth a second glance. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. Julian had inherited 3 things from his father: a title, a fortune, and a deep, settled distrust of anyone who wanted to be near either one. He had learned young that a smile in a ballroom rarely meant kindness, and that the loudest praise usually came from the hand most eager to reach into his pocket. So he stood at the top of the staircase most nights the way a man stands at the edge of a battlefield he has already walked 100 times, expecting nothing new. The winter ball at Ashwick Hall was the same performance it always was. Lady Prescott angled her daughter toward him with the subtlety of a merchant selling a horse. Lord Camden's nephew laughed too loudly at a joke that was not funny, hoping the Duke would laugh with him. Julian gave polite nods and short answers, and counted the minutes until he could retreat to his study, where at least the numbers in his ledgers did not pretend to like him. It was the stable hand who broke the pattern. He was young, perhaps 25, with the kind of stillness that most men his age had not yet learned. He crossed the ballroom only when necessary, carrying trays or coal or messages from the kitchens, and every time he did, the room curdled around him a little. A lady would draw her skirts aside. Another would murmur something behind her fan that made her companions laugh. He absorbed it all without so much as a change in his breathing, and that, more than anything, was what caught Julian's attention. Servants who were mocked usually reddened, or hurried, or kept their eyes low in the practiced way of people who had learned that flinching invited more cruelty. This one did none of it. He simply finished his task and returned to the shadows near the far wall, where he took up a position by the servants' passage and did not move again. Julian found himself counting how many times the young man's gaze crossed the room, and where it landed. Not on the dancers, not on the food. It went, again and again, to a slight figure near the kitchen door, a maid in gray who kept her chin down and her hands busy, scrubbing at a stain on the floor that had likely stopped needing scrubbing 10 minutes earlier. "You are staring at my staff, Your Grace," said a voice at his elbow. His aunt, Lady Beatrice, had come to stand beside him with a glass of ratafia she had no intention of drinking. She followed his line of sight and made a small, disapproving sound. The new stable boy, Marsh, I believe he calls himself, came with excellent references from up north, and not a single complaint since. Though I confess the girls do enjoy playing sports with him. Why? Lady Beatrice shrugged, the gesture of a woman who had never had to wonder why cruelty was entertaining to some people. He does not react. It offends them that he does not react. Julian said nothing to that. He was already thinking of the way the young man's shoulders had shifted, almost imperceptibly, whenever a nobleman drew too close to the maid in gray. It was not the posture of a servant guarding his own dignity. It was the posture of a soldier guarding a flank. He had seen that posture before in men who had served under Wellington. He had seen it in his own father's old guard captain, a man who could stand perfectly relaxed in a crowded room while tracking every possible threat within it. Stable hands did not learn to stand that way. Soldiers did. By the time the musicians struck up the second dance, Julian had made a decision that would have startled every guest in that ballroom. Had any of them thought to ask him what he was thinking at all? He was going to find out exactly who Marsh really was, and why a girl no one else would look at twice was worth guarding, as though she were the only thing standing between order and disaster. He excused himself from 3 separate conversations before he reached the edge of the room, and no one thought it strange, because the Duke of Ashwick excusing himself from conversation was not strange at all. What was strange, though none of them noticed, was where he went next, not toward his study, but toward the stables, where the cold night air smelled of hay and horse and the particular quiet of a place built for work rather than performance. He passed a cluster of young ladies near the terrace doors on his way out, and caught a fragment of their conversation before they noticed him and fell into the careful hush reserved for a duke's presence. One of them was describing, with obvious relish, how she had watched the stable hand trip over nothing at all and right himself so quickly that no one but her had seen it happen, and how she intended to mention it to her mother as proof that the estate ought to hire more careful men. Julian did not correct her, though he suspected the stumble she had witnessed was no stumble at all, but a soldier's reflexive check of his footing on unfamiliar ground, the kind of habit a man carried home from a battlefield and never quite managed to leave behind. It struck him, walking away from her laughter, how easily cruelty dressed itself up as observation, how a room full of educated people could watch a man perform quiet competence and see only an opportunity for mockery. He had grown up in rooms exactly like that one, and had spent most of his adult life believing there was little to be done about it beyond keeping his own conduct better than the standard around him. Tonight, for reasons he had not yet fully examined, that no longer felt sufficient. The stables at Ashwick Hall sat some distance from the main house, close enough for convenience and far enough that laughter from the ballroom reached them only as a faint hum, like bees behind glass. Julian walked the path without a lantern. He had grown up on this land and knew every turn of it in the dark. He found the door to the tack room ajar and a single candle burning low inside. Marsh sat at a narrow table with his coat off and his sleeves rolled, and for a moment Julian simply watched him from the shadow of the doorway, because what the young man was doing did not match the coat hanging on the hook behind him. He was cleaning a pistol. Not a hunting piece, but a compact traveling pistol of the kind carried by men who expected trouble on the road, and he was cleaning it with the practiced, unhurried economy of someone who had done it 1,000 times before, in worse conditions than a warm tack room. Beside it sat a folded letter, its wax seal already broken, and Marsh's eyes flicked toward the door before Julian had made a sound. "Your Grace." He rose immediately, the pistol disappearing into a drawer with a speed that told Julian everything about how much practice that motion had taken. "I did not expect company." Clearly, Julian stepped inside and let the door swing shut behind him. Stable hands do not usually carry weapons built for a gentleman's coach. A man who works with horses learns to be careful on the roads, Your Grace. Poachers, highwaymen. It only makes sense. It is only sense, Julian agreed. For a man who has been trained to use it well before he ever needed sense to survive on it. You handled that pistol like a soldier breaks down his kit before an inspection. He nodded toward the drawer. Which regiment? Something flickered across Marsh's face, gone before it could be named as fear, or perhaps it had never been fear at all, only calculation. "I have never served, Your Grace." "You are lying to me in my own stable," Julian said, without heat, the way he might have pointed out an error in a column of figures. "I would like to know why, before I decide whether it troubles me." Marsh's jaw tightened, and for the first time since Julian had arrived, he looked less like a servant caught out and more like a man deciding whether the person in front of him was friend or obstacle. "With respect, Your Grace, some questions are safer left where they lie." Safer for whom? The silence that followed told Julian more than any answer could have. He crossed to the small table and picked up the folded letter before Marsh could stop him. though the younger man's hand twitched toward it in a gesture quickly restrained. There was no name on the outside, only a small pressed mark in the wax that Julian recognized after a moment as a shipping merchant seal, the kind used by trading houses along the eastern coast. Not the seal of a stable hands correspondent. The seal of someone with property, contracts, cargo, the seal of someone with something worth protecting. "I will not read your letter," Julian said, setting it back down exactly where it had lain. "Though I could have. Consider that a courtesy, and consider carefully what you owe me in return." Marsh studied him for a long moment. The stillness Julian had noticed across the ballroom now turned fully upon him, assessing, weighing. Whatever the young man saw, it did not appear to satisfy him yet. "I owe you nothing beyond honest work, your grace, and that I have given freely since the day I arrived." "And the girl in gray? The one you watch as though the ballroom were a battlefield and she was the only prize worth holding. That landed." Julian saw it land, saw the flicker of alarm quickly smoothed back into calm. "I do not know the girl you mean. You are a poor liar for a man so skilled at everything else," Julian said, and this time there was no accusation in his voice, only quiet certainty. "I am not your enemy, Marsh, whatever your name truly is. But I do not tolerate secrets kept inside my own walls that might put my household at risk. You have 3 days to decide whether you trust me enough to tell me the truth. After that, I will find it out myself, and I promise you I am considerably better at finding things than you are at hiding them." He left before Marsh could answer, because he suspected the young man needed the silence more than he needed a reply, and because Julian himself needed the walk back to the house to settle the strange, unfamiliar restlessness that had taken hold of him. It was not simple curiosity. It had not been curious since the moment he watched the maid in gray keep her eyes down while a guardsman's shadow fell across her floor, and Marsh's hand had drifted, just slightly, toward his hip. Julian did not make a habit of visiting his own kitchens. A duke's presence below stairs unsettled the staff more than it reassured them, and he had learned long ago that people worked better and spoke more freely when they believed themselves unobserved. But 3 days after his conversation with Marsh, he found himself standing in the doorway of the scullery, ostensibly inspecting a delivery of Rhenish wine that required no inspection at all. The girl was there, exactly as he had hoped, kneeling beside a great copper basin with her sleeves pushed to the elbow and her hair escaping its pins in a way that suggested she had stopped noticing hours ago. She did not look up when he entered. Servants rarely did, trained as they were to make themselves as unremarkable as furniture. But there was something deliberate in the way she kept her eyes fixed on the water, something that felt less like habit and more like discipline. "You there," Julian said, choosing the tone he used with staff he did not recognize, mild and unremarkable. "What is your name?" "Nell, your grace." Her voice was steady, low, and careful in a way that made him listen more closely rather than less. "Nell Carter." "How long have you been in my service?" "Nell Carter?" 6 months, your grace." "And before that?" A pause, brief enough that most men would have missed it. "In service elsewhere, your grace." "In the north." It was the same answer Marsh had given, nearly word for word, and Julian filed that away with the same care he gave to a discrepancy in a rent ledger. He crouched, which he almost never did before a servant, and picked up a linen cloth from the basin's edge as though inspecting the quality of the wash. "You scrub floors very thoroughly for someone who has only just arrived. Most new girls miss the corners." "I was taught to do things properly, your grace, or not at all." "Taught by whom?" Her hands stilled in the water for the space of a single breath, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted, just slightly, into something crisper, more precise, the cadence of a schoolroom rather than a scullery. "My mother, your grace." Then, as if hearing the change herself, she caught it, and her next words came rougher, deliberately flattened, the vowels dragged down into something closer to the accent of the servants' hall. "She always said a job half done was worse than no job at all." Julian said nothing for a moment, only watched her, and she must have felt the weight of his attention because her shoulders drew in, the posture of someone trying to take up less space in the world than she actually occupied. "You have very fine hands for scullery work," he said at last. "No calluses along the knuckles. No burns from the copper." A girl who has spent 6 months at basins like this one ought to carry marks of it. I wear gloves when I can, Your Grace. Gloves would not explain the ink stain on the side of your smallest finger. He nodded toward it and watched her tuck the hand quickly against her apron. Too late to matter. Nor the fact that you hold a scrub brush the way a person holds a pen they are trying not to be seen holding. For the first time since he had entered the room, she looked up at him, and Julian found himself briefly unable to say anything at all, because her eyes were not the eyes of a frightened scullery maid caught in a lie. They were sharp and assessing and entirely unafraid, the eyes of someone who had simply decided, in that instant, how much danger he represented and had not yet finished deciding what to do about it. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said quietly, "but I have work to finish before supper, and I would not want to fall behind." It was a dismissal, offered by a scullery maid to a duke in his own house, and it should have offended him. Instead, Julian found himself almost admiring the nerve of it. He rose, brushed non-existent dust from his knee, and allowed her the retreat she had asked for, because he had learned what he came to learn. Whoever Nell Carter truly was, she had been educated somewhere that taught penmanship and composure in equal measure, and somewhere along the way she had learned to hide both so thoroughly that an entire household of servants had accepted her disguise without question. He thought, walking back through the corridor toward his study, of how many times he had passed servants in his own house without truly seeing them, how easily rank taught a person to treat other lives as background rather than substance. It was not a comfortable thought for a duke to sit with, but he sat with it anyway, turning it over the way he turned over a difficult figure in his accounts, until it resolved into something closer to resolve than guilt. Whoever this girl truly was, she had been failed by someone, badly enough that hiding in his scullery had seemed the safer choice, and Julian found he wanted very much to know who had failed her, and whether it was still in his power to set any part of it right. Only Marsh had not been fooled. Only Marsh stood at the edge of every room she entered, watching for exactly the kind of danger Julian himself now represented. He left the kitchens with more questions than he had carried in, and one certainty settling cold and clear beneath all of them. Whatever these two were hiding, it was not a servant's secret. It was the kind of secret that came with a price on someone's head. 3 days later, Julian attended a luncheon he would ordinarily have declined without a second thought. Lord Reginald Hartwell had a talent for making even a simple meal feel like a transaction, and Julian generally preferred to keep his distance from men who smiled too widely while asking after his investments. But Reginald had mentioned, careless and apparently certain no one was truly listening, that he had recently come into a rather significant piece of business regarding a deceased relation's estate, and Julian's instincts, honed by 3 days of unanswered questions, told him to accept the invitation. The luncheon was held at Hartwell House, a residence grand enough to suggest wealth and shabby enough at its edges to suggest that wealth was recently acquired, or recently spent faster than it arrived. Lady Constance Hartwell, Reginald's mother, presided over the table with the brittle graciousness of a woman accustomed to being obeyed rather than liked, and it was she, not her son, who first mentioned the name that made Julian's pulse quicken beneath his composed exterior. "Hartwell Shipping has been a burden these past 2 years," she said to a merchant seated near her, swirling wine she had barely touched. "Ever since my late brother-in-law's death, and that dreadful business with his daughter." "The girl who drowned," the merchant said, with the practiced sympathy of a man discussing a matter he found mildly interesting and nothing more. "So it was assumed," Lady Constance said, and something in her tone made Julian set down his fork entirely. "Her companion's body was recovered from the wreck of the packet ship. Hers was never found. The magistrate declared her dead after the customary period, which was, I will say, a mercy to the estate. Otherwise the guardianship would have dragged on for years." "And the estate now rests with young Reginald?" the merchant asked. "Pending final confirmation," Reginald said smoothly, joining the conversation with the practiced air of someone who had rehearsed this exact exchange more than once. "There is a formality regarding the will, a codicil my late uncle apparently added shortly before his death, which our solicitor believes to be invalid on account of a witnessing irregularity. Once that is settled, Hartwell Shipping and the estate at Hartwell Cross come fully under my management." "A convenient irregularity," Julian said, before he had entirely decided to speak. Reginald's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes went carefully flat. The law is the law, Your Grace. My solicitor, Mr. Pruitt, is most thorough. I am certain he is. Julian kept his own tone light, though every instinct in him had gone sharp and cold. A missing heiress, presumed drowned, her body never recovered. A convenient will dispute that returned a fortune to a cousin eager to claim it. A stable hand who carried a pistol and watched every door in a room. A maid with ink-stained fingers and a schoolroom voice she worked hard to hide. The pieces did not simply fit together. They slotted into place with the kind of precision that told Julian he was looking at something built deliberately, not stumbled into by accident. You seem troubled, Your Grace, Lady Constance said, watching him with the sharp attention of a woman who noticed everything and forgave nothing. Merely considering how easily fortune shifts hands when the person meant to inherit it is no longer here to object, Julian said, and let the words settle exactly as heavy as they sounded. The table went quiet for a moment too long, and Reginald's laugh, when it came, arrived half a second late. You have a poet's turn of phrase, Your Grace, for a man who deals mostly in ledgers. Julian smiled, the polite, unreadable smile he had perfected across 2 decades of rooms exactly like this one, and said nothing further on the matter. He had learned what he came to learn, and more besides. Somewhere in this county, a girl the world believed drowned was scrubbing floors in his own scullery, and the cousin who stood to inherit her fortune was sitting across the table from him, drinking wine paid for by a death that Julian was now nearly certain had never actually happened. He left Hartwell House earlier than politeness strictly required, already composing, in his mind, the questions he intended to put to Marsh that very evening, questions he suspected, this time, would finally be answered. The storm arrived at midnight, the kind that rattled shutters and turned the gravel drive to a dark, glistening river. Julian had not been able to sleep since the luncheon at Hartwell House. His mind turning over facts the way a man turns a locked box, searching for the seam that would let him open it. He was crossing the gallery toward his study when a thin line of candlelight beneath the library door caught his attention, flickering with the draft of someone moving inside. He should have called for a footman. Instead, some instinct kept his steps quiet as he eased the door open and found Nell Carter seated at his own writing desk, a single candle burning low beside her, and an open ledger, his ledger, the estate accounts for the Hartwell Cross property he had recently acquired an interest in through an old debt spread before her. She was copying entries into a small notebook with quick, sure strokes, her lips pressed thin with concentration, and for a moment Julian simply watched, because the sight before him bore no resemblance whatsoever to a frightened scullery maid. Her posture was straight. Her hand moved with the confident economy of someone who had spent years being taught to write well, not badly disguised as though it embarrassed her. The candlelight caught a small locket at her throat, slipped loose from beneath her collar, and the crest engraved upon it was unmistakable even at a distance 3 ships beneath a rising sun, the mark of Hartwell Shipping. You are very far from the scullery, Nell, Julian said quietly, and watched her go rigid. She did not startle in the way most people would have. She simply went very still, closed the notebook with deliberate slowness, and turned to face him with the same unreadable calm she had shown him in the kitchen. Your Grace, I can explain. I would very much like you to. I was looking for proof, she said, and her voice had changed entirely now, every trace of the flattened servant's accent gone, replaced by something clear and cultivated and, beneath the composure, exhausted. Proof that the codicil to my father's will was witnessed properly, and that my cousin's claim to Hartwell Shipping rests on a lie. Your acquisition of the Hartwell Cross debt gave you access to records my cousin has spent 2 years trying to bury. I did not think you would notice a maid slipping in to read them. I notice everything, Julian said. It is, as my aunt will tell you, an exhausting habit. You are Evelyn Hartwell. It was not a question, and she did not treat it as one. She simply held his gaze, chin lifted, and for the first time since he had met her, Julian saw the full shape of the person who had been hiding beneath 6 months of scrubbed floors and lowered eyes. I am, and I would ask, Your Grace, that you tell no one, not until I have found what I need. Your cousin believes you drowned. My cousin arranged for me to drown, Evelyn said, and something raw finally broke through her composure, quick and sharp as a struck flint. My companion did not survive the crossing. I did, because Gideon pulled me from the water before the wreckage could take me under with her. We have spent 2 years proving that the packet ship's sinking was no accident, and that my father's true will, the one that leaves Hartwell shipping to me and not to Reginald, still exists somewhere in Mr. Pruitt's office, hidden behind a false one that favors my cousin instead. Gideon, Julian repeated. Your stable hand. My father's ward, Evelyn said. Raised alongside me since I was 8 years old, trained for the army before my father's death left him without a commission to buy, and sworn, long before either of us understood what that promise would cost, to protect me with his life if it ever came to that. It very nearly has twice. Julian looked at the ledger still open on the desk, at the careful notes in her small, sure hand, at the locket she had not bothered to tuck away again, and felt something in his chest settle into a decision he had not consciously made but recognized, all the same as final. You have spent 2 years gathering proof alone, in disguise, protected by one man against an entire family determined to see you erased. We have managed. You have survived, Julian said. That is not the same as managing. As of tonight, you no longer do this alone. He closed the library door softly behind him and crossed to the desk, drawing out the chair opposite hers. Show me exactly what you have found, Lady Hartwell, and let us discover together precisely how much trouble your cousin has made for himself. Evelyn studied him for a long moment before she slid the ledger and her small notebook across the desk, and Julian understood, from the caution in the gesture, that trust for her had become a costly thing, spent only after careful calculation of what it might buy and what it might risk. You should know, Your Grace, that helping me makes you a target as well. My cousin has already arranged one death that looked like an accident, and he will not hesitate to arrange another if he believes it protects what he has taken. I have survived a great many people who wished me ill for a great many lesser reasons than yours, Julian said. Ambitious relations, jealous rivals, men who resented a title they believed they deserved more than I did. I find I am not easily frightened by a solicitor's forged signature and a cousin's convenient story, however far he has already gone to protect it. Then we begin tonight, Evelyn said, and for the first time since he had met her. Scrubbing floors that did not need scrubbing. Something in her voice sounded almost like relief. Gideon Marsh arrived at the library within the quarter hour, summoned by a footman Julian trusted with his life and, more importantly, with his silence. He entered with the wariness of a man expecting an ambush, and the sight of Evelyn seated calmly across from the Duke, an open ledger between them, did nothing to ease the tension in his shoulders. Your Grace. He inclined his head, though his eyes went immediately to Evelyn, checking, Julian understood now, for any sign of distress. I was told my presence was required. Sit, Gideon, Evelyn said, before Julian could speak. He knows. I gathered that much from being fetched at midnight. Gideon lowered himself into the remaining chair with the same careful stillness he carried everywhere, though Julian noted the way his hand rested, briefly, near the small of his back, where a blade or pistol might once have sat before 6 months of stable work had softened his habits, if not his instincts. How much does he know? Enough, Julian said. To understand that you have spent 2 years keeping a murder from becoming a second one, and that you have done it with remarkably little help. Help draws attention, Gideon said. Attention draws Reginald's men. We learned that lesson early, when a solicitor in Bristol who agreed to examine the original will was found dead of a fall down his own stairs 3 days later. The coroner called it an accident. I did not. Julian felt the last of his doubt fall away, replaced by something colder and more useful. Tell me everything from the beginning, and leave nothing out because you have decided I am not yet trustworthy enough to hear it. It was Evelyn who spoke first, her voice steady even as the story it carried was not. Her father, Sir Edmund Hartwell, had built Hartwell shipping from 3 merchant vessels into a fleet of 12, and had raised his only daughter to understand every ledger, every contract, every clause of maritime law that governed his trade, because he had always intended her to run it after him. His will, drafted the year before his death, left the company and the Hartwell Cross estate entirely to her, with Gideon named as her legal guardian until she reached her majority. Reginald, his nephew and nearest male relation, had contested the will within a month of Sir Edmund's funeral, producing an earlier document that left the estate to him instead, and had found in Mr. Pruitt a solicitor willing to declare the earlier will valid and the later one improperly witnessed. The witnesses to my father's true will were his valet and his physician, Evelyn said. Both men died within a year of my father, one of a fever, one of a fall from a horse he had ridden safely for a decade. I do not believe either death was an accident, though I have never been able to prove it. And when contesting the will directly grew too dangerous, Julian said slowly, understanding building with every word. Your cousin arranged for the packet ship. We believe so, Gideon said. We cannot prove that either, not yet. What we can prove, if we find it, is that a second copy of the true will exists. Sir Edmund was a careful man. He would not have trusted a single document, kept in a single office, with a fortune this size resting on it. Then we find the second copy, Julian said. And we find it before your cousin finishes whatever scheme currently has him circling my ballroom with such confidence. Gideon studied him for a long moment, the same assessing stillness Julian had first noticed across a crowded dance floor, and something in his posture finally eased, fractionally, the wariness of a soldier deciding, at last, that the ground beneath him might actually hold. Why would you risk your own name on this, your grace? Reginald Hartwell has friends in the same rooms you do. Because I have watched an entire ballroom mock a man for guarding the only honest thing in it, Julian said. And I find I have very little patience left for people who mistake cruelty for wit, or theft for inheritance. Lady Hartwell's fortune is not my concern. Her survival, now that I know the truth of it, very much is. Evelyn looked at him then with an expression he could not entirely name, something between disbelief and the first cautious edge of hope, and Julian understood, with the same quiet certainty that had first drawn his attention across the ballroom, that whatever came next, he intended to see it through to the end. The search for the second will took the better part of 2 weeks, conducted in careful stages that never drew the household's notice. Julian's own solicitor, a sharp, unassuming man named Mr. Whitfield who had served the Ashwick family for 30 years without ever once betraying a confidence, was brought quietly into the arrangement. And it was Whitfield who first suggested where Sir Edmund might have hidden a document he did not trust to any single office. A man who built a shipping fortune would understand better than most that cargo split across several vessels survives a storm that would sink a single ship carrying everything, Whitfield said, over a supper none of them had much appetite for. If your father was as careful as you describe, Lady Hartwell, he would not have left a copy only with his solicitor. He would have left one somewhere he trusted absolutely, and told almost no one where. It was Evelyn who remembered, 2 days later, a small detail from her childhood that none of the men in the room would have thought to ask about. Her father's habit, every year on her birthday, of adding a single entry to a private journal he kept locked in his study. A journal he had once told her, laughing, held everything that truly mattered, tucked where only she would think to look. She had assumed it was a sentiment. Now she suspected it was instruction. The journal, when Gideon finally retrieved it from Hartwell Cross under cover of a supply visit that raised no suspicion from the skeleton staff Reginald, had left to maintain the empty house, held both. Pressed between its final pages was a sealed copy of Sir Edmund's true will, witnessed not by the valet or the physician who had since died, but by the estate's old shipbuilder and his wife, both still very much alive and living in a cottage near the Hartwell Cross docks, entirely unknown to Reginald or his solicitor. We have it, Gideon said, laying the sealed document on Julian's desk with the careful reverence of a man setting down something that had cost 2 years and very nearly 2 lives to recover. Now we only need to present it. Presenting it quietly hands your cousin time to destroy the witnesses before a court can hear them, Julian said. He has already shown he is willing to arrange deaths that look like accidents. A quiet legal filing gives him weeks to arrange 2 more. It was Whitfield who proposed the alternative, cautious at first, then with growing conviction as the plan took shape between them. Ashwick Hall was to host its annual midwinter ball within the fortnight, an event that drew every family of consequence in the county, Reginald and Lady Constance included, as they had attended every year of Julian's tenure without fail. A public revelation, made before witnesses too numerous and too prominent to silence or discredit, would leave Reginald no room to maneuver, no quiet corner in which to arrange one more convenient accident. "It is a risk," Evelyn said quietly. "If it fails, Reginald will know exactly where I am, and exactly what I intend, with no evidence yet before a magistrate to protect me." "It is a risk either way," Gideon said. "The only question is whether we choose the ground we stand on, or wait for him to choose it for us." Julian looked between them, the woman who had spent 2 years hiding in plain sight and the man who had spent those same 2 years standing between her and every danger that found her, and felt the shape of the plan settle into something he was prepared to see through, whatever it cost him. "Then we choose the ground. My ballroom, my witnesses, my terms. Whitfield will have the shipbuilder and his wife brought quietly to the house before the ball, along with a magistrate I trust to act the moment the will is produced. Reginald will not see this coming, because he has spent 2 years believing you were too frightened, and too alone, to ever fight back in the open." "I was not alone," Evelyn said, glancing at Gideon, and then, for the first time, at Julian himself. "Not for a very long time now." Word reached them 3 days later, through a stable hand Reginald employed who owed Gideon an old debt from their soldiering days, that Mr. Pruitt had scheduled an urgent audit of the Hartwell shipping accounts, to be finalized the same week as the midwinter ball, with a formal petition to have Evelyn Hartwell declared legally deceased once and for all, closing the estate to any future claim she might make. Reginald, it seemed, had grown impatient waiting for a body that would never surface, and intended to bury the truth by decree instead. The trap, Julian realized, had been set from both directions now, and only one of them would walk away from the ballroom floor with the fortune, and the future, still intact. That night, after Whitfield had gone and Gideon had returned to the stables to keep his usual watch, Julian found Evelyn still in the library, staring at her father's journal without reading it, her composure worn thin in the privacy she believed she had. He did not announce himself, only took the chair across from her, the way he had the first night she had trusted him with the truth. "He wrote my name on every page," she said quietly, not looking up. "Every entry, however small, began with my name, as though he wanted to be certain that whoever eventually found this book would know exactly who it belonged to, and who it was meant to protect. I keep thinking of how frightened he must have been, in those last months, to hide his own will inside a book of birthday wishes rather than trust it to the men whose profession was supposed to be trust itself." "He was not frightened," Julian said. "He was careful. There is a difference, and I suspect you have inherited rather more of his carefulness than you give yourself credit for." She looked up at that, something unguarded crossing her face before she caught it and folded it away again, and Julian understood that whatever came of the ball 2 days hence, he had already come to care a great deal more than a duke was strictly meant to care about the outcome of a shipping heiress's legal claim. 2 days before the ball, Julian sat with Whitfield in the study long after the household had gone to sleep, working through the precise legal mechanics of what they intended to do, because Julian had learned, across a lifetime of managing an estate, that intention without procedure was worth nothing in front of a magistrate. "A will produce dramatically before a crowd makes for a fine story," Whitfield said, adjusting his spectacles over a stack of documents. "But it makes for poor law unless every requirement is met precisely. The witnesses must be present and willing to swear to their signatures. The document itself must be shown to match Sir Edmund's known hand, which we can establish through his shipping correspondence, still on file at Lloyd's. And the magistrate must be one Reginald cannot later claim was improperly chosen, or biased in Lady Hartwell's favor." "Sir Magistrate Wren," Julian said. "He has ruled against my own interests twice in boundary disputes with neighboring estates. No one in this county could reasonably accuse him of favoring me." "An excellent choice." Whitfield made a note. "There remains the matter of the codicil dispute your cousin filed 2 years ago. If the true will is authenticated, it does not merely restore Lady Hartwell's inheritance. It exposes the earlier document Reginald submitted as forged, or at the very least fraudulently represented as the final will. That is not a civil matter any longer. That becomes a criminal one." Evelyn, seated near the fire with the shipbuilder's sworn statement in her hands, looked up at that. "I do not want him hanged, Mr. Whitfield, whatever he has done. The law rarely hangs men for forged documents," Whitfield said gently. "Fraud of this scale, proven before a magistrate, typically carries transportation or imprisonment, along with the forfeiture of any property gained through the deception. Whether the courts pursue the matter of the packet ships sinking as attempted murder will depend on evidence we do not yet possess, and may never possess, given how carefully your cousin has covered that particular trail. Then let the will speak for itself, Evelyn said. Let it restore what is mine, and let the magistrate decide the rest according to what can actually be proven. I would rather Reginald face consequences the law can defend than accusations I cannot fully support, however much I believe them to be true. Julian watched her say this with something close to admiration settling quietly beneath his ribs. She had every reason to want her cousin ruined utterly, and instead she reached, without hesitation, for the standard of proof rather than the satisfaction of accusation. It was, he thought, exactly the instinct that would make her formidable, running a shipping empire built on contracts and maritime law, where a captain's word meant nothing against a properly witnessed manifest. There is one difficulty, Gideon said, from where he stood near the window, arms crossed, watching the dark drive as though Reginald's men might appear on it at any moment. Pruitt's audit concludes the same day as the ball. If the petition to declare Lady Hartwell deceased is filed and processed before we present the true will publicly, we may find ourselves arguing against a legal presumption already fixed in the record, rather than simply presenting new evidence. Then we do not wait for the ball's formal proceedings to begin, Julian said, an idea forming with the same cold clarity he brought to a difficult negotiation. Sir Magistrate Wren will be among the guests. We present the will the moment Reginald and Lady Constance arrive, before the dancing starts, before Pruitt's petition has any chance to be read into record elsewhere. We choose the moment, not merely the ground. Whitfield nodded slowly, already reworking his notes to account for the shift. It will need to be done publicly enough that Reginald cannot later claim the proceeding was improper, and privately enough at first that he has no warning to attempt anything foolish before witnesses are gathered. He has already attempted several foolish things, Gideon said grimly. I would rather he attempt nothing further with a magistrate and 40 witnesses standing between him and the door. Evelyn set down the shipbuilder's statement and looked around the room at the 3 men who had, each in his own way, spent the past weeks building the case that would either restore her life or, if it failed, end whatever remained of it. Then let us make certain it does not fail, she said quietly, because I do not intend to spend 1 more year hiding in someone else's kitchen while my cousin spends my father's fortune. Julian found himself, not for the first time in recent weeks, thinking that Evelyn Hartwell would have made an excellent Duchess, and then setting the thought firmly aside, because there remained a great deal of work to finish before either of them could afford to think of anything beyond the ball still 2 days distant. The chandeliers of Ashwick Hall blazed the same gold they always did, and the guests arrived in the same silks and the same practiced smiles, and to anyone watching from the gallery, the midwinter ball looked exactly like every ball that had come before it. Julian knew better. Sir Magistrate Wren stood near the refreshment table in plain evening dress, unremarkable to anyone who did not know to look for him. The elderly shipbuilder and his wife waited quietly in the small drawing room adjoining the ballroom, along with Whitfield and the sealed will. Gideon, no longer dressed as a stable hand but as what he truly was, a gentleman's ward in a well-tailored coat, stood near the main doors, watching them the way he had once watched every entrance in every room Evelyn had ever entered. And Evelyn herself, no longer Nell Carter of the scullery, stood beside Julian at the top of the staircase in a gown of deep blue velvet that Lady Beatrice had procured on 2 days' notice and considerable secrecy. Her chin lifted, her hands steady, waiting. Reginald Hartwell arrived fashionably late, Lady Constance on his arm, both of them smiling the easy, confident smiles of people who believed the ground beneath them entirely secure. That confidence lasted exactly as long as it took Reginald to look up the staircase and see, standing beside the Duke of Ashwick, the cousin he had spent 2 years believing drowned at the bottom of the channel. The color left his face so completely that Lady Constance's hand tightened on his arm before he had said a single word. "Cousin Reginald," Evelyn said, her voice carrying clearly across a ballroom that had gone, in the space of a heartbeat, entirely silent. "You look as though you have seen a ghost." "This is impossible," Lady Constance said, recovering faster than her son, though the tremor beneath her composure was unmistakable to anyone listening for it. "The magistrate declared her dead. There was a ruling." Rulings, Julian said, stepping forward, can be reconsidered when new evidence comes before the court. Sir Magistrate Wren. He gestured, and the magistrate approached from the refreshment table with the unhurried authority of someone who had been waiting precisely for this moment. I believe you will find the matter of some interest. Whitfield emerged from the drawing room with the shipbuilder and his wife behind him, and the sealed will in his hands, and read, before the assembled guests of the county, the true terms of Sir Edmund Hartwell's final wishes, witnessed and confirmed by two people very much alive and standing in the room to swear to it. The silence that followed broke into a low, rolling murmur of shock that swept from the staircase to the farthest corner of the ballroom. This is a forgery, Reginald said, too loudly, the words cracking slightly at the edges. Produced by a woman who has been hiding, for reasons of her own, from her rightful family. Hiding from a cousin who arranged the sinking of a packet ship to remove her permanently from any claim to her father's fortune, Gideon said, moving to stand beside Evelyn now that the truth no longer needed protecting through disguise. I pulled her from that water myself, Lord Hartwell. I have wondered, every day since, exactly how you slept at night, knowing what you had done. You have no proof of that, Lady Constance snapped, though her eyes had gone wide and calculating, already searching the room for an exit that did not exist, given the number of guests now standing between her and every door. We have proof enough of the forged codicil, and of Mr. Pruitt's willingness to authenticate it against his own better knowledge, Whitfield said calmly. Sir Magistrate Wren is already familiar with the case, and I suspect the matter of the packet ship will merit its own separate inquiry, given what has just come to light this evening. Sir Magistrate Wren stepped fully into the exchange now, his voice carrying the flat, unhurried authority earned across 30 years of making certain his rulings could not later be undone by embarrassment or influence. Lord Hartwell, Lady Constance, I will require you both to remain in the county pending a full review of this estate and the circumstances surrounding Lady Hartwell's presumed death. Given the evidence Mr. Whitfield has presented, I am satisfied there is more than sufficient cause to overturn the prior ruling, and to open a formal inquiry into the conduct of Mr. Pruitt as well. Reginald's composure finally cracked entirely, his voice rising in a way Julian suspected the young man had never once allowed himself in public before. You cannot simply "this is my inheritance. I have managed this estate for 2 years. I have mismanaged it, spent a considerable portion of its reserves, and now stand accused before witnesses of fraud severe enough to warrant criminal proceedings," Julian said, his voice cutting cleanly through Reginald's rising panic. I would advise you to consider very carefully what you say next, in a room full of people who will remember every word of it. Reginald said nothing further. He simply stood, pale and shaking, as two of the magistrate's men, present at Julian's quiet request from the start of the evening, moved through the crowd toward him, and the guests of Ashwick Hall's midwinter ball watched, in a silence far more genuine than any polite murmur the ballroom had ever held before, as the fortune everyone had believed settled for 2 years came undone in the space of a single quarter hour. The formal inquiry took the better part of the winter to conclude, but its outcome was never seriously in doubt once the true will had been read before a room full of witnesses too prominent to be silenced or ignored. Mr. Pruitt lost his license to practice law and faced his own separate proceedings for knowingly authenticating a forged document. Lady Constance retreated to a small dower property left to her by her late husband, her standing in society reduced to whispers and closed doors wherever she went. Reginald Hartwell was convicted of fraud on a scale severe enough to warrant transportation, though the magistrate's court, lacking sufficient evidence to connect him directly to the packet ship sinking, could not add a charge of attempted murder to the judgment. Evelyn had accepted that outcome with the same steady composure she brought to everything, though Julian suspected, privately, that some quiet part of her would carry the unanswered question for the rest of her life. She had chosen, in the end, to let the law hold what it could actually prove, rather than reach for a punishment the evidence could not support, and Julian found he respected that choice more than he could easily put into words. Hartwell Shipping returned fully to Evelyn's control by spring, and within a season she had already begun reshaping it in ways her father, Julian suspected, would have been proud to see. New contracts with fairer terms for the captains who sailed her vessels, a portion of profits set aside each year to support the families of sailors lost at sea, and a standing arrangement with a firm of honest solicitors, Whitfield's own recommendation, to ensure that no document bearing her family's name would ever again be forged without swift and certain discovery. Gideon remained at her side, not as a disguised protector any longer, but as precisely what he had always been beneath the stable hand's coat. A trusted friend and, at Evelyn's insistence, a full partner in managing the shipping company's northern routes, a role that suited his steady, watchful temperament better than any ballroom ever had. He married, the following autumn, the daughter of the shipbuilder whose testimony had helped save Evelyn's inheritance, and Julian noted, with quiet satisfaction, that the two of them had first properly met while planning the very testimony that changed everything. As for Julian himself, the months that followed the midwinter ball rearranged something in him that he had not expected and, for the first time in longer than he could easily remember, did not resist. He found reasons to call at Hartwell Cross that had less to do with shipping contracts than he pretended, and Evelyn, for her part, stopped pretending she did not notice. Their courtship, when it finally became one openly rather than in the careful, unacknowledged way it had grown across weeks of shared danger and shared purpose, was conducted with none of the performance Julian had spent his whole life distrusting in ballrooms. It was built instead on the same foundation their alliance had been built on from the very first night he chose to follow a stable hand's watchful eyes across a crowded room. Honesty, plainly spoken, and a willingness to see each other clearly rather than as titles or fortunes to be won. They married the following summer, in a ceremony considerably smaller than society expected of a duke, attended by Whitfield, by Lady Beatrice, by the shipbuilder and his wife, and by Gideon, who stood as groomsman exactly as he had once stood guard, steady and unwavering, at the edge of every room Evelyn entered. Julian thought often, in the years that followed, of that first winter ball, of the ladies who had turned up their noses at a servant they judged unworthy of their notice, never once suspecting that the man they mocked carried more honor in his quiet vigilance than the whole glittering room combined. He thought of Evelyn, scrubbing floors that did not need scrubbing, hiding a fortune and an education and a courage most of society would never have credited her with, simply to survive long enough to reclaim what was rightfully hers. And he understood, more clearly with each passing year, that the truest measure of a person was never found in the cut of their coat or the seat they were given at a ball. It was found in what they did when no one important was thought to be watching, and in whether they stood their ground when everything they loved depended on it. Ashwick Hall hosted its winter ball again the following December, chandeliers blazing gold as they always did, and this time it was the Duchess of Ashwick who stood at the top of the staircase beside her husband, watching the room with the same sharp, unclouded attention that had once kept her alive through 2 years of hiding. Somewhere below, a new stable hand carried a tray across the floor without complaint, and Evelyn made certain, this time, that no one in her household ever again learned to look past a person simply because his coat was plain and his hands were rough with honest work. She had also made certain, in the year since her marriage, that every young woman in her acquaintance understood at least the basic shape of the documents that governed her own inheritance, her own guardianship, her own claim to whatever her family intended to leave her, because Evelyn had learned, at great cost, that a fortune left unread on paper was a fortune easily stolen by anyone confident enough to rewrite it. She hosted small gatherings each spring at Hartwell Cross for exactly that purpose, tea and conversation dressed up as nothing more than fashionable socializing, though Julian knew, and rather admired, the quiet education happening beneath it. A person who understood her own legal standing, Evelyn liked to say, could never again be made to disappear simply because someone else found her absence convenient. Julian, for his part, found that marriage to a woman who read contracts as carefully as she read people had made him not only happier than he had expected to be, but considerably harder to deceive in every deal that touched Ashwick Hall. He counted that, along with everything else the past year had given him, among the finer trades he had ever made. If the story stayed with you, tell me where you're watching from tonight. I would truly love to say hello, just to know how far this story has traveled to reach you. And if you want more nights like this one, subscribe, and I will see you in the next story.